The NHL Four Nations tournament has had all its teams play now, with the Tkachuks and Team USA defeating Finland 6-1 last night. We break down that game, discuss the NHL's World Cup of Hockey plans, and look ahead to Saturday's tournament matchups, all on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Friday, everyone, and happy Valentine's Day if you choose to celebrate. Thanks for making Locked On NHL your first listen every day. I am Rachel Donner from Locked On Flyers. I'm here every Friday with Gil Martin of Locked On Islanders. You can find our show on YouTube or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Subscribe to get our latest episode here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Gil, I think this Four Nations tournament so far, I'm having fun, but it's very it's a limited amount of fun here. I will say. How about you?
Why is that? Why is it limited?
I think honestly, I don't know. We'll get into it more later on the tournament so far, but it's been an adjustment for me in terms of the style of hockey. And I think we're 2 games in, but I'm not quite there yet of NHL hockey versus this, which is very different in my opinion. We saw that on Thursday night as Team USA defeated Finland 6-1. And I think basically the top line view of this game for me is that Finland was in it until they weren't, right? It was like a very steep drop off almost immediately right near the end of the second period in this game.
Yeah, and the first 3 minutes of the third period, Team USA just put
Done.
the game away.
Yeah.
And yeah, they just pulled away from the Finns, and got to give the Tkachuks a lot of credit. They both had excellent games, and when you have 3 points from Matthew with 2 goals from Brady, it's almost like the Tkachuks beat Finland, not single-handedly, but they were the catalyst.
For sure. And they started off on different lines and then they quickly realized we have to fix this, right? And so they moved Brady up and Jack Eichel was in a Kachuk sandwich there in the middle. And that was a fantastic line. They of course had the best expected goals for of any of the lines in the game overall. And I think much like we saw in the Canada Sweden game the day before, it took everybody kind of a little bit to get the chemistry going. But I think for Team USA, that's what the difference was, right? So, once they settled into it and figured out how they were going to run things and how the flow of the game was going to go, that's when they could kick it into gear and get better scoring chances.
Yeah, and I think that's to be expected, that
Yep.
players who haven't played together a lot as teammates are going to take a little time to get that chemistry. And maybe that's why putting the Tkachuk brothers, who have probably been playing hockey against or with each other since they were kids, gives Team USA a little bit of an edge because they know what each other are likely to do on the ice.
Yeah, I think that helped quite a bit. And I think that, uh, it never hurts when you have that situation. I think on, the defensive side of things, Zach Werenski was the standout for me in terms of Team USA's blue line. He had 3 assists in the game, and I just felt like he was everywhere and he was doing everything.
He was involved, yeah, from the very beginning. He even took a penalty, I mean, he
Yeah.
did a little bit of everything. And I think that overall his his presence just added a little. He was sort of a catalyst, I think, in a lot of ways for Team USA.
Yeah, I do think so as well. I think, looking at the Finland side of things a little bit, I could say that they were definitely missing Mira Heiskanen and Rasmus Ristolainen on the blue line. Like, you could definitely see them being overwhelmed. They miss, like, Mira Heiskanen's, I think, agility and just ability to get the puck up the ice. Ristolainen is very, very good at driving the play outside and very good at the board battles. And I think that against especially as highly skilled a team as Team USA is, like, both of those guys just would have made such a huge difference for them.
Yeah, and I think it really hurt that transition from defense to offense,
Mhm.
and especially early in the third period when Team USA kind of put the game away. That's where I think they felt it the most.
Yeah, and you saw it kind of play out in some of the stats, right? Where obviously, like Team USA was gonna play a physical game. They had 32 hits. Finland had 16. Finland's not generally a super physical team, but Risto is that guy,
Right,
right? That's
right.
going to do all of that for the Finns, and he wasn't there. And I think that absolutely made a difference as well. And then just from a skill perspective, you know, Finland had 23 giveaways in this game. And I think ultimately, like when you cough up the puck to Jack Eichel and the Kachucks, like
Yeah.
what is going to happen there,
You're
right?
playing with fire is basically what you're doing, and
Yeah,
eventually you're going to get burned.
right. Exactly. So I do want to give them credit though, because, you just look at the final score and you don't really know the context of the game, you feel like, "Oh, man, they just got completely demolished." And they did, but it was really only for, like, a period of hockey, right? They did actually play okay to good for considerable portions of that game. I don't think it's as big a disaster as it seems like it from the score, and I do think they could be competitive against Sweden.
I think they can be too. The game was closer than the final score, especially for the first
Yes.
two periods.
Yep.
And then you had those 3 goals in, like, 3 minutes early in the 3rd period, and that sort of put the game away. But, I mean, Finland scored first. They're only down 1 goal after 40 minutes. It's not like they were just dominated from the
Yep.
get-go. You could think that looking at the final score, but that's not the way the game played out. And I think the whole key for Finland is how do they react to this? How do they regroup?
Right. So, as far as the goaltending goes, I mean, obviously, when you have Connor Hellebuck in net, like you tend to have to worry less. But I do think he had to make some really important saves in the game. I think that while he wasn't nearly as busy and only faced 21 shots on goal, there were certainly more shot attempts than that by Finland. And I think that he did the job that he had to do. I don't necessarily think it was an easy game for him.
No. And he the thing about goaltending, very often it's not just the number of saves, but how you make them and when you make them. And he was there when they needed him. And that's all you could ask of a goalie in any given game. Connor Hellebuck, I think, gives Team USA the advantage in a short tournament like this, where if he gets hot, Team USA could ride him and maybe steal a game or two that they don't deserve to win.
Yeah, I agree. And, on the other side of things, you say Saros, it was probably a struggle for him a little bit, but you look at two of those four goals that were scored later in the game were power play goals. And
Right.
so, I think he was in a very, very difficult situation there and facing a very talented power play. I mean, sure, would you like him to have stopped 1 or 2 of those? Absolutely, but was it a horrible game by Saros? I don't think so.
Yeah, I can't blame UC Soros for Finland's loss. That's
No.
not the way this game played out. And the other thing is this, and you alluded to it, the fourth line players on all 4 of these teams
Yeah,
are top 6 guys in the
I know,
NHL. So
I know.
you give those guys a power play with extra time and space, you're playing with fire. That is a dangerous thing to do, and it did definitely cost Finland in the first game against Team USA.
It did. All right. They are switching up the matchups for Saturday's games. We're going to talk about them later in the show. But in the meantime, we're going to talk about the tournament so far and the NHL's plans for a 2028 World Cup of Hockey coming up next.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. When the games tip off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you could stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you could even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether I'm backing my team for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch three, I never feel like I missed my chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA.
All right, so we're 2 games in to the NHL Four Nations face-off, which is the full technical name for the tournament here. But I think, we alluded a little bit to the fact that these teams are getting to know each other and build chemistry. So, as far as the hockey itself so far, how you feeling about it?
It's getting there. It's not quite an NHL game. It's certainly not an all-star game.
No,
Lack
it's
of
somewhere in
quality.
between, right?
Yeah, this is not shinny in a rink. I mean
Right.
that's not what we're seeing. But it's not actually quite an NHL game. Where are you on this?
Yeah, I felt like, especially in that first game of Canada versus Sweden, I was, like, not really into it, to be honest, until the overtime. The overtime was
It was great.
phenomenal.
Yeah,
You watch these guys with this level of skill with open ice like that, you were talking about the power play earlier. It's pretty similar to that. It was bonkers. It was end to end. It was fast. And that's the one thing about it that I'm really loving is the speed of the game. That first game was a track meet. I would say the second game was slightly less so, but still like very, very fast. And that's the part I appreciate. But it's just so much less physical overall because like people don't want to get hurt. We'll talk about Shea Theodore
yeah.
later, but I think that it is like this weird hybrid kind of hockey situation, right?
I mean, I think that's what I expected. I didn't expect to see a full checking game like we would see in the playoffs, let's say, in the NHL. But I didn't expect an all-star game, up and down the ice, breakaway after breakaway either. By the way, the overtime, if the NHL would go to a 10-minute overtime and ditch the shootout, I'd be all for it.
Yeah, that is another aspect of it that I'm loving, right? Is this 10-minute overtime. I'm glad we got an opportunity to see that right away and what it could be, especially because the game-winning goal was scored at the 6-minute mark.
Right.
I think it just says like if we just extend it to 10 minutes, it'll reduce the number of shootouts that we have and I think, you know, one might suggest that you pair it with a 3-point system to encourage people to win in regulation and then win in overtime as opposed to just hanging out for a shootout, that it's a 3-point game no matter what,
Right.
once you go into extra time. Like, I think that there's a lot more incentive here when you have a 10-minute overtime, I think.
There is more incentive with the 10-minute overtime, and I just think it's more exciting. And I still
Yeah.
have sort of this fundamental opposition to settling games with a skills competition.
Yep.
There's a reason they don't do it in the playoffs. And if you're not willing to do it in the playoffs, why are you doing it in the regular season?
Right, right. And, I think about it in comparison to soccer all the time, which does do it in their big games,
Yes,
right? They
they
get
do.
those, but they have a full 30 minutes of extra time, right? 2 15-minute extra time periods there to get it done, which I know it's a whole different sport, but nonetheless, like even soccer ends their biggest competitions with that quote unquote skills competition at the end if there isn't a conclusion there. The least hockey could do is extend the overtime to 10 minutes, right?
I would love to see the NHL do it now. Maybe the biggest issue with that is the TV time that the extra overtime would take, and the networks aren't going to be thrilled with it. But for the fans, for the actual integrity of the game, I think it would be a big step forward.
Yeah. What do you think about the atmosphere thus far?
Well, I think it's been pretty good. I mean, you know, unfortunately, we are seeing some of the politics of the real world intruding on this tournament with fans in Canada booing the American national anthem. I get it. I don't like it, but I get it. And that's reality. It's going to, the politics of the day are going to intrude in the world of sports, whether we like it or not sometimes.
Yeah, part of me hopes that all of this leads to getting rid of national anthems at NHL games and other sporting events because I've never quite understood why we do that in the first place. But in an
Or we could have
international
a good line and
competition,
clap shot. That's why.
well, but I think, like, in an international competition like this, where it's literally countries against each other, like, I like when they do the anthem of the winning team at the end. That
Right.
makes sense to me, like, at the end of the game, but, like, doing them both of them before the game doesn't make sense to me. So, what do I know? But, Matthew Tkachuk's comment after the game, like, "I didn't like it, and that's all I've got," was the political answer to a very heavy political question.
Right.
And, I get that, of course, but at the same time, like, I agree with the, uh, ability of fans to express themselves how they need to, as long as it's not, like, hurting anybody, and booing is not hurting anybody, as Gary
Yeah.
Bettman would tell you over and over again. So and
As he
as he is.
urges people on to boo him
Yes.
even more.
Exactly, exactly. So, I think you just gotta let it happen how it happens there for this. But, yeah, I think it's fun so far. I think we'll see how Saturday goes with USA versus Canada, and, we'll go from there. Meanwhile, the aforementioned Gary Bettman and, Marty Walsh, they officially announced that they're planning the 2028 World Cup of Hockey, to kinda alternate every 2 years, like the 2 years in between the Olympics there. It would be in season in February, similar to this Four Nations tournament, except it would be 8 teams this time around and moving forward. So, what are your initial thoughts about this?
Well, two things. I prefer 8 teams to 4 teams. I still think there were some really talented hockey players who just weren't eligible for this tournament. And I think realistically, this tournament was kind of a dry run to see whether or not they were going to go ahead with this World Cup of Hockey in some ways. Yet, you know, doing it in the middle of the season where you have to shut down for a couple of weeks. I like it for the Olympics for certain reasons, but I'm less liking it for an internal tournament.
Right. So interestingly, Gord Miller from TSN posted a really interesting thread. I saw it on Blue Sky. I don't know if it was also on Twitter, but uh, he had said that there is a little bit of resistance from the European federations here, that they weren't entirely aware that this announcement was coming now or in this fashion. They're upset about the timing, to your point, because it would cut into their seasons, their individual countries, leagues seasons, as well as the IIHF tournament schedule. There's some issues about IIHF money and how it gets distributed to the different federations. And if the NHL has an NHL only event that takes some of their players away from things like Men's Worlds, because they'll have already done this, World Cup situation, like how does that affect the distribution of IIHF funds to all these different member nation federations? And, I think that there's some issues with full teams, right? Because if they're limiting it to NHL players, there's some countries that in theory should be in this tournament because of NHL stars. Like you look at Germany, for instance, right? So you have Moritz Seider and Leon Draisaitl, who are two of the top players in the NHL. And there are certainly not enough Germans in the NHL
No.
to ice a full team, right? So what do you do?
Yeah. Do you extend it to the AHL players as well? Do you go with European players, or do you exclude Germany, or do you put together Team Europe?
Like a Team Europe,
Yeah,
right? Which is what they didn't wanna do in the first place, which is why they didn't have a Team Europe and a Team North America,
right.
which they did last time around, which was great, right?
Yeah. It creates all kinds of questions, and obviously they have a little time right now to work out these kinks.
Mhm.
It's a little arrogant and a little surprising that the European federations weren't even aware this announcement was coming. You're just like, wait a minute, you didn't even you're making this announcement, you didn't even talk to them about it. That's
Right. So, and it's kind of like the NHL is trying to create leverage for themselves by putting this out there in a more formal way. The discussions have been out in the world, right, for
right.
several years about the potential for this, but to make it more of an official statement without the negotiations, it kind of like lets the NHL put the thumb on the scale of all this, and these
Yep.
European federations have to kind of kowtow to what the NHL wants to do here, which is completely unfair.
Yeah, they're basically forcing the issue.
Mhm. Yeah, so there's a lot of details to be worked out, especially if they want a European host city as part of this, like they say. So we'll see what happens there with all of that moving forward. They have some time to plan, of course, because next year is the Olympics, and then this wouldn't happen for another 2 years. So we're 3 years away from all of that. In the meantime, this Saturday, we have two matchups. We have Sweden versus Finland and USA versus Canada to talk about. We're going to do that coming up next. All right. So the big game is, of course, USA versus Canada here, the two winners from the previous games in the tournament. We talked a little bit about Shea Theodore and the injury, and I know they've talked about it on previous shows this week a little bit, but I think, expanding on that in terms of the implications, first off, he's week to week now. So that has huge implications for the Vegas Golden Knights, right? He's on their
Big time.
second pairing.
Yeah, and that's I think the biggest thing as an NHL hockey fan that you didn't want to see. Have this tournament, but if players get injured for what is essentially still an exhibition, and that affects the NHL season, that's not what you want. That's counterproductive, is I guess the best way to put it, because now this all-star tournament is affecting the standings going forward. And as much as I don't enjoy the fact that there's no physicality in an all-star game, there's also very rarely injuries in an all-star game because there's
Right.
no physicality.
Right. And that's why when we're talking about it's sort of this hybrid version of like true NHL hockey and a more international style of play. But when you have like an international tournament that's out of NHL season, I think they're a little bit more physical
Yeah.
than they would be in this circumstance. And, Shea Theodore is a prime example there. Now, initially in the tournament, when they said, you couldn't have any replacements once it started, they kind of caved on that a little bit that you couldn't have a replacement until you were going to be short a player. And that's why there's an extra forward, extra defenseman, extra goalie on everybody's roster. Travis Sanheim from the Flyers will be checking into the lineup for Canada on Saturday versus Team USA. That means they're at 6 defensemen. They have called up sort of Thomas Harley from the Dallas Stars as a standby replacement. So he's there in case there's an injury. And even, in case there was an injury in practice today, that he
Right.
could step in as a replacement. They weren't going to let him do that at first, but then they were like, nah, that makes sense that he has to be there in case there's a practice
He's
injury.
now the official designated black ace.
Yes, exactly. So, and then he'll travel with the team to Boston as well to be on standby. But, knocking on wood, I hope nobody else gets hurt from any of these
Yeah.
teams over the weekend. But any predictions for USA versus Canada?
Oh, boy. I'll tell you, I think top to bottom, Canada may have a slightly better roster, but the advantage Team USA has is in between the pipes. And, to me, Binnington is very streaky. If he's on his game, he could be as good as anybody during that streak. But if he's not on that hot streak, he can be very inconsistent. And Connor Hellebuck, as I alluded to earlier, I think he gives Team USA an edge because he is the best goalie in the world right now, in my opinion.
Right. So you stick with Bennington, though, in this game?
Probably.
Yeah.
I think goal is the big question for Canada more than anything else.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think you don't have a choice, and you
Hmm.
stick with him. Obviously, Hellebuck is going to play for Team USA.
Yeah.
Like, would not change a thing there, but it will. I think it's going to be a really intense game. I think obviously the Montreal crowd is going to have a lot to
Yeah.
say about it, but I do also think that Team USA is very well constructed here, and so I do think that it's going to be a competitive game in the end. I'm almost a little nervous to make a prediction. I kind of think Canada's still going to win, but I think it's going to be very close
Okay.
for sure. For Sweden versus Finland, I think my big question here is: are they going to make any goalie changes for either of these teams?
Yeah, and that'll be interesting to see. I would tend to think they might. Look, this is a very important game because the loser is in big trouble as far as winning this tournament is concerned. So you got to pull out all the stops. It'll be interesting to see whether either team changes goalies.
Yeah, I would tend to think like they might give Lankinen a shot in this game, but if Saros is your number one and Finland is your biggest rival, that's who you put in,
Right.
right?
Right.
If that is what they have decided. But I would not be upset on behalf of Finland if they did put Lankinen in net there. And then for Team Sweden, you just go with Gustafsson. Like, he's the
Yeah.
best option
Gustafson's the guy.
no matter what. And he did have a really good game against Canada. So I just don't anticipate them making any significant changes there on the Sweden side, because I thought they played a very good game.
They did, and they came back too. So yeah.
Yeah. So I still think Sweden's going to win this one, just again because Finland just has some missing pieces here with all the injuries they've had on their roster. So I think ultimately that's where it lands, but I do think it's also going to be a very competitive game.
Yeah, I was just about to say the same thing. I think Sweden has to be the favorite, but don't discount the Finns. As much as they are dealing with injuries, first of all, this is a great rivalry. And second of all, you just, I don't think you can underestimate Finland. You do that at your own risk.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, when these two teams play each other, literally anything could happen.
Exactly. It's fun.
Like, at any level, like
Yes.
no matter
Kiwi,
what.
it's like, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, we'll see how these games turned out, and our colleagues will talk about them next week. Gil, you'll be back on Monday to talk to hosts from around the Locked On NHL channel about what's going on with their teams, and we'll be back next Friday as well as the tournament wraps up with the championship on Thursday night of next week, and I will be in Boston to cover it. So looking forward to doing that on our Friday show next week. Thanks for making Locked On NHL your first listen today. For your next listen, find Locked On Fantasy Hockey. Become a fantasy hockey expert. Get the edge over your league mates with daily tips from Steal and Flip. Find Locked On Fantasy Hockey on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Have a great day, everyone.